exhibition NATO, History of Deception, History of Evil, is dedicated to history of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the largest military and political alliance in the world, created back in 1949 to contain the Soviet Union. After the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, NATO not only did not cease to exist, but expanded and doubled the number of its member states from 16 to 31. The leaders of NATO have repeatedly described it as peaceful and defensive, but reality proves otherwise. For the last 30 years, NATO has repeatedly intervened into inner affairs of other states, up to direct military interventions. As of now, NATO is waging war by proxy against Russia, using Ukraine as its proxy, supplying it with weapons and training Ukrainian soldiers. Why did NATO have to expand relentlessly and close its military infrastructure on Russia's borders? Why did the North Atlantic Alliance wage wars in Asia and the Middle East? What is NATO really fighting for? All these questions are answered by the exhibition investigation of the history of NATO, the history of lies and deception, the history of aggression, terror, and war. The exhibition is organized by the autonomous non-profit organization of Additional Education, Center for Public Education, with the support of the Presidential Fund for Cultural Initiatives, prepared by the State Central Museum of Modern History of Russia in cooperation with the Association of Historical Parks Russia is My History. The monumental painting was executed by the artist Alexander Kupalyan. Our investigation begins not from the events of days gone by, but from the most recent events of our history, from the complicated crisis in Ukraine, which was in no small part provoked by the policies of NATO. The exhibits in this hall highlight how, over the years, NATO has been steadily transforming Ukraine into its proxy state, which it can use in military provocations against Russia. Let me be clear, Ukraine's lawful place is in Euro-Atlantic family. Ukraine's lawful place is in NATO, and over time, with our help, this goal will be achieved, said NATO's General Secretary Jens Stoltenberg in Kiev in April of 2023. This hall is divided into two parts. The first one highlights gradual alliance of Ukraine and NATO. The second one tells us a story of Donbass resistance against Ukrainian government, the tragedy of civil population, and the beginning of special military operation. Ukraine's cooperation with NATO began as soon as 1991. Right after gaining independence, Ukraine entered the North Atlantic Council. In 1994, Ukraine also entered the Partnership for Peace program and sent its peacekeeping forces in Bosnia and Herzegovina. In 2008, Kiev applied for full-time NATO membership. Ukraine's leaning to an anti-Russian military bloc provoked several instances of civil unrest in the country. For example, in 2006 in Feodosia, people protested against joint military exercises Sea Breeze. Similar protests also occurred all over the country. Despite that, using American help, Ukraine modernized military airports in Borispol, Ivano-Frankovsk, Odessa, and built the Naval Control Center in Ochakov. Ukraine's goal to fully enter NATO was further cemented in Ukraine's constitution of 2019. In 2022, during the conference in Munich, President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, alluded to the possibility of Ukraine obtaining nuclear missiles. In 2014, an armed coup took place in Ukraine. In response, the wave of civil protests spread throughout the southeast regions of Ukraine. The root of the protests lied in the unwillingness of new Ukrainian government to address the concerns of the people from southeast regions, who wanted to preserve close ties with Russia. Another reason for the protests was the activity of Ukrainian ultra-rights and their aim to apply the same methods of armed pressure on the people of Donbas, which had already been proven successful during mass riots in Kiev, including but not limited to armed violence, vandalism, and monument destruction. The antagonism between the people of Donbas and the government in Kiev eventually grew so strong that the demands for autonomy of Donbas were replaced by the demands of full independence. In April of 2014, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics were formed. In order to regulate the crisis, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, Germany, and France devised a series of peace treaties under the name of Minsk Agreements. In practice, however, these agreements did not stop the conflict, but merely froze it. Ukrainian military used this time of relative peace in order to modernize its army, put heavy economic sanctions on Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and fortify its own defenses. Over the course of 8 years, from 2014 to 2022, thousands of people in Donbas fell victim to Ukrainian bomb shellings and diversions. The complete disregard of Minsk agreements by the government in Kiev, as well as a constant military threat to the people of Donbas, forced the leadership of Russian Federation to officially recognize the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics on 21st February of 2022. In this showcase, we present an armband of the Sparta Battalion of People's Militia of Donetsk People's Republic, as well as private belongings of Vladimir Zhoga, codename Vokha, the warrior of People's Militia and the commander of Sparta Battalion. Zhoga became the second commander of the battalion after death of its founder and first commander, Arseny Pavlov, codename Motorola. Zhoga, Motorola, and many others were completely ordinary people: fish sellers, mechanics, drivers, car shop workers, common folk who, because of historical circumstances, were obliged to stand up to protect their homeland, their language, their cultural identity. Vladimir Zhoga also died in the Donbas conflict on 5th March of 2022 while fighting for Volnovakha city. He became the first fighter of People's Militia to be awarded post-mortem by the Order of Hero of Russia. Nowadays, the Sparta Battalion continues to operate. It is commanded by Vladimir's father, Artyom Zhoga. And Vladimir Zhoga became only the first of many heroes of Donbas to be awarded post-mortem too as the heroes of Russian Federation. On 24th February of 2022, Russian Federation announced the beginning of special military operation. Its goals were described by President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, as follows: protection of Donbas population, securing Russian integrity, and demilitarizing Ukraine. The special military operation demonstrated heavy integration between Ukrainian armed forces and the armed forces of Northern Atlantic Alliance. This integration can be demonstrated and proven by the exhibits placed in this hall, like anti-tank missile NLAO, produced in Great Britain and Sweden, and the fragment of ballistic missile Storm Shadow. Since the beginning of special military operation, Ukraine received $203 billion from external sponsors. This amount exceeds Ukrainian total GDP by $30 billion. In essence, Ukraine is being bankrolled by the West. From the beginning of special military operation, 54 countries declared their military support for Ukraine. Many of the exhibits displayed in this hall were obtained by the special Inter-Museum Task Group created back in 2022 under the orders of Ministry of Culture of Russian Federation with the support of Russian Historical Society. The group consists of historians from major museums of Russia, including Museum of Contemporary History of Russia, Historical State Museum, Museum of Victory, the Central Museum of Armed Forces, and others. The main goal of this task group is to collect exhibits and artifacts all over Donbass, even on the battlefield. The people in the group visited all major sites of conflict and battle in Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. Many of these exhibits tell a story of a great tragedy of Donbass civil population. Like, for example, this door from a simple car ridden with bullets with just one word, children, written on the window. This simple doll was found in a house in Stanitsa Luganskaya, in a house destroyed by Ukrainian fire in the summer of 2014. This doll can be considered a symbol of a tragedy that befell the population of Donbass, the tragedy from which not even children were spared. In October of 2014, the Ukrainian ex-president Petro Poroshenko said this about children of Donbass, children of the people who only wanted to protect their homeland and their right to speak in their native language. Our kids will go to schools and kindergartens. Their kids will hide in basements because they are good for nothing. This is how we are gonna win this war. The sculpture presented in this showcase is dedicated to the children of Donbass, those who perished during 8 years of conflict. It was made by Donetsk's artist Viktor Petrovich Mikhailov. It is made from the fragments of bomb shells used by Ukrainian armed forces to shell Donetsk during those 8 years. It is called the Griven Mother. Its original version is supposed to stand in one of Donetsk's churches. In this showcase, a road sign is presented. It was situated on the borders of Donetsk city, and as you can see, it is ridden with numerous bullet holes. Over the course of special military operation, it became clear that merely recognizing the independence of Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics was not enough to protect the population of Donbass. Therefore, the leadership of Russian Federation decided to grant an opportunity to the people of Donbass, an opportunity to officially enter the Russian Federation as its new subjects. In September of 2022, the referendums were held on the lands of Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, as well as in Khersonskaya and Zaporozhskaya regions. According to official Russian database, 99% of voters in Donetsk People's Republic voted to enter Russia, 98% in Lugansk People's Republics, 93 in Zaporozhskaya region, and 87 in Khersonskaya region. On 30th September of 2022, in the Georgian Hall of the Big Kremlin Palace, Official documents about formal integration of these lands into Russia as the new regions of Russian Federation were signed in a formal ceremony. What for was NATO created all the way back in 1949? What is the true essence and true purpose of this organization? The answers are provided in this hall. After the end of World War II, the world was divided in two camps: the Western, or the capitalist camp, led by the United States, and the Eastern, or the socialist camp, led by the Soviet Union. The USSR bore the main burden of World War and became a superpower in process. Its recent ally, the United States, suffered minimal losses through the World War. The antagonism between two camps quickly deteriorated into the Cold War, which necessitated the creation of military defensive blocs. On 4th April of 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty was signed in Washington, and NATO was officially born. One of the first politicians to officially announce the beginning of new geopolitical confrontation was former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. In his famous speech made in American city Fulton on 5th March of 1946, Churchill blamed the Soviet Union of creating the Iron Curtain to divide the world and called to America and Britain to strengthen their partnership in order to combat the threat of communism. The Fulton speech of Churchill became the Cold War manifesto of sorts, while the creation of NATO can be considered a response to his demand. NATO was co-founded by 12 states: Belgium, Great Britain, Denmark, Italy, Iceland, Canada, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, France, and the United States. NATO's main goals were described by its first General Secretary, British officer Gastings Ismay, as follows: keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. The first expansion of NATO occurred in 1950s. In 1952, Greece and Turkey joined the bloc. In 1955, Western Germany was also granted membership in NATO, and its military potential quickly grew from that point on. Thus, the post-war principle of German demilitarization was broken. After the end of World War II, most war criminals of Nazi Germany were tried in Nuremberg and found guilty. But officers and generals of the Third Reich were of particular interest to the United States for two major reasons. Firstly, they were all radical, ideologically driven anti-communists. Secondly, they had an invaluable experience of planning and organizing combat operations against the Soviet Union, the experience that the United States lacked at the moment. Thus, in 1950s and 1960s, many former Nazis were transferred to Western structures. Many former officers and generals of Wehrmacht found new high-ranking jobs in NATO and CAI. Heusinger, Speidel, Gehlen, Ferber, Steinhoff are just some of the examples. Their experience was used to create clandestine underground terrorist and intelligence cells, to prepare and command troops in Europe, and to plan combat operations against the countries of the socialist bloc. The idea of separate peace negotiations with Western countries, or even the breakup of the Allies and the formation of a new alliance against the Bolsheviks, has spread among the highest echelons of military command in Nazi Germany as early as in 1944, when the strategic initiative was already firmly overtaken by the Allies and the Second Front opened in Europe. It was becoming more and more apparent that the war on two fronts was unwinnable for Germany. The main criticism against Hitler and his cronies from German military command was that Hitler was too careless and allowed Germany to enter an unwinnable war on multiple fronts. An attempt to negotiate with the British government, though unsuccessful, was taken by SS Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler in May of 1945. And on 7th May of 1945, Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz, handpicked by Hitler as his successor on the post of Reichspräsident and Commander-in-Chief, addressed the German officers in his farewell letter. Dönitz explained openly that the current war was lost, with no hope for German victory or even peace negotiations. At this point, only total capitulation was possible. However, Dönitz then explained further. Obviously, he said, we must now join the Western countries and cooperate with them on the occupied lands in the West, because that is our only hope to ever get our land from the Russian hands. It is worth noting that by our lands, Dönitz meant not just the lands of Germany, but also the territories in Eastern Europe that were freed from Nazi occupation by the Red Army. Fortunately, any plans and attempts to break up the Allies during the war proved unsuccessful. The war was won by the free world. The international military trial took place in Nuremberg and condemned the Nazi crimes. Karl Dönitz himself was found guilty of multiple war crimes and crimes against peace and sentenced to 10 years in prison. However, unfortunately, in the long term, his sinister prediction turned out not to be so incorrect after all. Adolf Heusinger, one of Hitler's major generals who developed Operation Barbarossa, the strategic plan for invasion into USSR. In 1961, Heusinger was appointed the chairman of the NATO Military Committee in Washington. Hans Speidel, another seasoned Nazi, fierce nationalist, in 1957 he was appointed the commander of the NATO Allied Land Forces in Central Europe. One of the major assets of the United States and NATO was Reinhard Gehlen, Major General who controlled an extensive spy network in Eastern Europe during the days of World War II. In 1945, Gehlen voluntarily surrendered to the United States and was transferred into America. He helped to set up the so-called Gehlen Operation, an even more extensive spy and intelligence network operating in Eastern Europe against the socialist bloc. It employed seasoned Nazi officers and was paid generously from the American pocket. For decades, open war of NATO against the socialist bloc remained unfeasible. The Soviet Union continued to be the powerful deterrence factor, so the Cold War never escalated into a hot one. But the alliance was not staying idle. From 1950s to 1980s, NATO conducted a campaign of terror in Europe under the name of Gladio, which means sword in Italian. Gladio was the code name for a clandestine operation to establish a secret network of militant neo-Nazi groups across Europe. Initially, Their goal was to organize resistance in case Western Europe was invaded by the socialist countries. In reality, they waged a campaign of terror against leaders of the European left and the civilian population, while setting up the radical left groups to take the fall. This way, the population of Europe was kept in constant fear of the lefts, and NATO's reputation as the only defense against the communist threat solidified further and further. The biggest terror attacks performed by the Gladio organization were as follows: the bombing in Piazza da Fontana in Milan on 12 December of 1969, 17 dead, 88 injured. The kidnapping and murder of Italian Prime Minister, Social Democrat Aldo Moro on 16th March of 1978. And the biggest terror attack in Italy's history, the bombing of Bologna Central Railway Station, which killed 85 people and injured 200 more. Line art by Danish caricaturist Herluf Bidstrup occupies a special place at our exhibition. His picture "NATO is pregnant with war", created in 1981, is still topical today. Many countries, especially over the last 30 years, experienced firsthand what NATO brings to the world under the disguise of freedom and democracy. At the beginning of 1980s, NATO's policies provoked a new cycle of the arms race. To keep their edge over the Soviet Union, on 12 December of 1975, the North Atlantic Council decided to deploy 572 medium-range missiles all across Europe. In response, a massive wave of protests swept over the continent. The protests were especially fierce in Spain, which had joined NATO in 1982. But despite the population being against it, in 1983 the missiles were deployed in Germany, Spain, Great Britain, Italy, and other countries. The relationships between the United States and the Soviet Union deteriorated once more, and NATO's policies provoked a new cycle of the Cold War and the arms race. By the middle of 1980s, a new foreign policy doctrine was established in the Soviet Union under the name of New Political Thinking. It implied de-escalation of the Cold War, normalization of relationships with Western countries, and cooperation with any country, regardless of ideological differences. Among other things, the Soviet Union took a beneficial stance towards the unification of Germany. In return, Mikhail Gorbachev was promised by General Secretary of the United States, James Baker, that NATO would not extend an inch eastward from that point on. The Chancellor of Western Germany, Helmut Kohl, took a similar stance, while the German Social Democrat Egon Bahr declared that a new system of collective defense must be established in Europe, and it must include the United States, the Soviet Union, Canada, and major European countries. Bahr reiterated again and again that such system could only exist if NATO was guaranteed not to extend further eastward. But in reality, the promises of Baker, Kohl, and other Western politicians remained verbal, and Washington felt no obligation to actually fulfill them. After 1991, after the collapse of Soviet Union and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, the North Atlantic Alliance started to expand further almost immediately. After the Soviet Union's collapse, a major deterrence factor disappeared from the global policy. Now the world is unipolar, and the United States' dominance in it is undeniable. Now, with the use of NATO, any country in the world can be destroyed in the most cruel way possible. Though the North Atlantic Treaty establishes an official equality of all its member states, in reality, the United States' dominance in the alliance is undeniable. The supreme commander of NATO allied forces is always an American general. The United States initiated the majority of NATO military operations. All member states agreed to the United States' demand to allocate at least 2% of their GDP for military purposes. Over the last 30 years, NATO performed 5 direct military interventions. It turned whole countries into scorched earth and the zones of humanitarian catastrophe. Each of those interventions cost the countries that fell victims to NATO tens, if not hundreds of thousands of victims, millions of broken lives. Yugoslavia became the first country to fall victim to NATO's aggression in modern history after the end of Cold War. At the beginning of 1990s, Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia started to collapse, which led to several armed ethnic conflicts in its territory between Serbs, Bosnians, Croats, and Albanians. NATO attempted to regulate these conflicts with mass bombings, 2 times in fact, in Bosnia in 1994 and in Kosovo in 1999. The Bosnian War was the first war in modern history NATO actively participated in. To support Bosnians and Croats, in 1994, NATO started to bomb Serbian positions, and over the course of the war, more than 100,000 of civilian population died, and more than 200,500 were forced to leave their homes. From 1998, NATO began to support Albanians of Kosovo who wanted to secede from Yugoslavia. Russia tried to resolve this crisis peacefully and even called for a peace conference in the French town of Rambouillet. But on 24th of March of 1999, without getting permission from the United Nations Security Council and breaking all the norms of international law, NATO began mass bombings of Yugoslavia. On this day, Russian Prime Minister Evgeny Primakov was supposed to visit the United States. But after receiving the news about the beginning of military operation in Yugoslavia, Primakov decided to cancel the visit and turned his plane around above the Atlantic Ocean. Over the course of this military operation, NATO performed more than 38,000 of military raids and dropped more than 28,000 tons of explosives on Yugoslavia in order to force Belgrade to officially recognize Kosovo. From 3,500 to 4,000 civilians died as a result. More than 40,000 buildings were destroyed, including schools, kindergartens, radio stations, and hospitals. Yugoslavia was put on the brink of humanitarian disaster.
Serbia помнит.
On September 11th of 2001, the biggest terrorist attacks in American history took place. 3 planes crashed into the Twin Towers of World Trade Center in New York and into the Pentagon building. The terrorist organization Al-Qaeda, banned in Russia, took responsibility for the attacks. After the end of the Cold War, NATO was rapidly becoming irrelevant. But the attacks of 9/11 allowed the alliance to declare the new global goal, war on terror, and conduct military operations far beyond the North Atlantic regions. In In 2001, NATO began its longest and the most expensive operation yet, Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. It lasted for 20 years, till 2021, and cost the alliance's budget $2.5 trillion. The official goals of this operation were to secure and maintain peace in Afghanistan, to support the government of Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, and to fight the radical Islamist movement Taliban banned in Russia. In reality, however, neither of these goals were ever accomplished. By August of 2021, the last American soldiers left the country, and the government they had supported all these years was immediately overthrown by Taliban. Over the course of this operation, more than 175,000 of Afghani citizens died. One of such operations was the invasion of Iraq, which began on 19th March of 2003. The formal reasoning for the invasion was that the Iraqi government was supporting terrorists and concealing chemical and biological weapons on its territory. Both accusations were not proven conclusively. By May of 2003, the whole territory of Iraq was occupied by the Allied forces. But the invasion brought neither peace nor stability to Iraq. The immediate results of the invasion and the destruction of Saddam Hussein's government were deep political and economical crisis and a wave of terrorist attacks. More than 300,000 Iraq citizens fell victims to the aggression. In 2011, inspired by the Arab Spring, civil protests against Muammar al-Gaddafi's government started in Syria. They soon escalated into a full-blooded civil war. The United Nations declared Libya a no-flight zone, but NATO used this situation to its advantage in order to change the regime in Libya into more agreeable and pro-Western. NATO Air Force made more than 26,000 sorties in 8 months, including 7,000 aimed for bombings. Hostilities ended only in October of 2011. Muammar al-Gaddafi was brutally murdered by the militant opposition. But this did not bring peace to Libya. For years, Libya sank into the chaos of further civil war. Waves of refugees ran from Libya to Europe. Numerous terrorist organizations obtained large caches of weapons. From 2014, NATO participates in a civil war in Syria, supporting militant opposition. Officially, NATO is there to combat Islamic State, a terrorist organization banned in Russia. But in reality, the alliance pursues another goal: to depose the legitimate government of Syrian Arab Republic in order to replace the current regime in Syria with more loyal to the West. The result of this policy is inability of Western structures to cooperate with Damascus in order to combat the terrorists. The American military presence in Syria to this day is an obstacle in the way of restoration of national unity and the end of civil war. A multimedia installation presented in our hall demonstrates the dynamics of NATO expansion, both during the Cold War and after its end. At the moment of its inception, the North Atlantic Alliance consisted of 12 member states. In 1952, Greece and Turkey were drawn into the alliance. In 1955, Western Germany also joined. In 1982, after Franco's dictatorship has fallen, Spain also became member of NATO. Therefore, during the Cold War, the number of NATO member states increased from 12 to 16. However, the peak of NATO expansion took place at the end of 20th century and at the beginning of 21st century, at the moment of United States domination in the world, at the moment of unipolar world structure. In 1999, Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic joined NATO. In 2004, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Slovakia, Slovenia, Romania, and Bulgaria also became full-time members. In 2009, NATO accepted Albania and Croatia into its ranks. In 2017, Montenegro. In 2020, North Macedonia. In 2023, Finland. As of today, Sweden, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, and Ukraine are candidates for full-time membership. Throughout its 75-year-long history, NATO has served as a tool of American dominance in the world. Throughout its history, the alliance used lies, deception, terror, and aggression in order to achieve its goals. Throughout its history, the alliance demonstrated constant discrepancy between the official rhetoric, peaceful and democratic, and real actions, hypocritical and cruel. Today, many countries of the world, some in the West derisively call the Second World or the Third World, are rising up against imperialistic neo-colonial system. Peace is the key value to all people on our planet. But peace is impossible when certain countries strive to achieve absolute dominance with no regards for the consequences. Today, the American dominance in the world and its military and political tool, NATO, are the main threats to peace and stability of the world.